Hi, my name is Sean McIntosh. I'd like to thank you for joining us today for this webinar on the impact of indirect access on SAP licensing. The way SAP is enforcing these rules around indirect access can inadvertently lead to huge audit settlements. Our presentation today will delve into what indirect access is and how you can be proactive in terms of preventing exposure. Our speaker today is Hans Morkens. Hans has worked in the software audit field for many years and is our SAP licensing specialist. The lines will be muted during the webcast, and questions will be answered at the conclusion of the presentation. If you have any questions, please submit them via the chat console, and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available for encore viewing at method180.com. We will also email you links to show notes and the presentation itself in the days ahead. Hans, could you please address the next slide? So Method 180 helps our customers cut through the confusing jargon and legal language of software contracts. We marry that language to our knowledge of software asset management to drive real software cost reductions on your behalf. What we do is all about reducing your software licensing costs. Hans, could you please advance one more? We're generally able to help folks who find themselves in a software audit and need help defending themselves. We also help you when you're negotiating with a major software vendor. Our experts will help you get the best possible deal, always with an eye to reducing your cost and exposure while maintaining compliance. We also help folks who want to be proactive about software asset management and want expert guidance and resources at their fingertips. Often this involves self-assessments, which are kind of like internal audits using our SAM Compass tool. SAM Compass quickly, painlessly, and agentlessly, that's a word, generates your licensing position. I'll send some information in the show notes about where you can learn more about SAM Compass. But with that, I'm going to turn things over to Hans to really dig into SAP licensing. So over to you, Hans.
Thank you very much for the introduction there, Sean. So as was already mentioned, today's presentation will be around SAP Indirect Access. Now, the reason why we picked this specific topic, and if you follow the news, you'll probably be aware of why this is the case, is some recent court rulings that have been popping up. So first of all, about a year ago, you might have seen these headlines coming up in the news. So Diageo had a licensing issue with SAP for about 54 million pounds, which is about $70 million US. And we've had several discussions in between ourselves and with other SAP licensing experts to see, okay, was this correct? And there's quite some arguments about this. Now, the presses weren't even called, and straight after, there were some new headlines popping up. So apparently, there's a new court ruling where this has not been decided yet, but it's out there, where SAP is now going after AB InBev, the world's largest beer brewer, for $600 million US. And even within the software asset management world, where we do see some big numbers regularly, this is quite extreme. So that's why we thought it might be good to have an extra webinar on this specific topic to show, okay, what is this about? Now, the first thing we want to highlight here is that it is not a new thing. We have been seeing this for decades already, or expecting this to pop up more and more, because this has always been out in the SAP contracts and has always been flying over there and has always been coming up every now and again. What is new, and that is the important part and why SAP is starting to pursue this more and more, is that they would now have a legal precedent. So now at least one court has ruled that, okay, their wording and their contracts are actually going to hold up, and everyone can be exposed if they use a similar setup. So in this webinar, we hope to answer the following questions. So first of all, what specifically is it, and what contractual wording should you watch out for? The second one is, how do you identify it? Have you got any risks? Where specifically would you find them? If you do have them, of course, you will want to address them. And if you have addressed them, you still want to make sure that it's not going to pop up in the future. So how will you manage this risk going forward? So first of all, what is indirect access? And to dig a bit deeper in that, it's important that we figure out first, okay, what's the basic on SAP licenses? And most of you are probably aware of this already, but you should be aware that SAP, for their main systems anyway, there's always exceptions, has a dual licensing system. So the one hand, you've got a package license, so this is what you pay for, what you use for your actual product that you buy, and SAP uses every single possible metric out there and more for this product. So this literally can be as strange as a license per oil barrel and things like that. But we'll leave those package licenses aside and look at the other side, where in addition to this, you've got a named user license. And a named user license allows the user to use any number of SAP applications, so any number of packages, but every single user should have at least one license. So this is fairly clearly defined in their software use rights, so specific copy from their document. The use of any package requires both a named user license and a package license, and you need to hold a named user license for any individual accessing any package. Now, I'd say this is fairly straightforward and reasonable. SAP is not the only vendor using dual licensing, so this should not be an issue, and most of our customers are aware of this and agree that it is a fair practice. What we do want to highlight in this specific section is a specific word, use. And the reason why I'm going to dig a bit deeper in this is because we got a separate definition, and it's been part of a lot of the discussions that have been involved with indirect access. So first of all, let's go over this definition. So use means to activate the processing capabilities of the software, to load, execute, access, employ the software, or display information resulting from such capabilities. So specifically, that last bit already makes us wonder, like, hang on, that seems to involve a lot more than we should expect from most vendors. The other ones are more defendable, but let me paint a bit of a scenario here, just to show you what the impact could be of this specific use. And to highlight, so use, every person that uses, so follow this definition, requires a license. So say your organization has a payroll system, as many organizations do, where obviously the SAP administrators that process the payroll system, everything, so load data in there, execute things. I don't think anyone will argue that those SAP administrators require a license. But now, in a payroll system, I don't think it's that unlikely that you would say, okay, we might want our employees to be able to see, okay, this is their monthly pay, this is what taxes they pay, this is what other things we do with their paycheck, what holiday is applied, things like that. So we build an application that will show the different employees, okay, this is your payroll. It's already a little bit more ambiguous, but most people could agree that, okay, so they activate the processing capabilities, as in to load specific section, and display specific outcomes. It's ambiguous, but there you could still agree, well, in some cases that might be applicable depending on what they're doing. But let's take it one step further and say, okay, say the CFO every quarter or every year asks the SAP administrators, okay, could you provide us with a report on the full payroll for the entire company, everything that we're spending this year? So SAP administrators collecting this data, again, they're fully licensed users, no one's arguing that, and they provide a spreadsheet to the CFO saying, okay, this is the amount we spent. Now, practically, if you look into the definition, this CFO is looking at information that resulted from the processing capabilities of the SAP system to get to this full SAP payroll system. So again, the only thing he's receiving is an Excel spreadsheet, but all of a sudden, he would require a license as per this definition because he uses the software. And if we even look at this a bit further, you could even argue that, say, okay, maybe the CFO wants to publish this in the annual report, to spread this over the internet, as a lot of companies do. So all of a sudden, the whole world is looking at information that is gathered to processing capabilities of SAP software. And I think the further we got into this discussion, or the further we got into this train of thought, the further people will say, well, I mean, look, those first cases, okay, we could agree to some extent, but those last, I don't think anyone can agree that you would require a license for everyone on the internet just because you publish a number from an SAP system. And now, this is a very extreme scenario, and I do want to clarify that this is definitely not something SAP is pursuing, but we do want to highlight this is something they could pursue based on their definition of what is use. And that's why we're saying, well, everything, if they put it like this, is use. And this is practically what you are agreeing to if you've got an SAP agreement. So if we look into that second part of this, and that is where indirect access comes along, is this is also the case if you use through a custom built or third-party application. So this could be any interface to your system or any data that is shared from the SAP system through another system, independent of how many layers in between. So it's anything could be part of anyone that touches at the very slightest SAP data from your company suddenly would be indirectly accessing your system. And if you want to compare this, if you're more familiar with some other vendors, for example, Microsoft and Oracle would have defined it as multiplexing, but we do the difference is that in this case, it seems like SAP puts the definition slightly further, and the minimal other way that you can license this. So to compare this, though, SAP published an indirect access white paper after a lot of complaints from customers to clarify some of these topics, and this is what they produced. So basically, any custom app, third-party software that would link to the SAP ERP or HANA systems, or it doesn't matter, as in the last scenario, any number of layers, third-party apps that goes through a platform and then gets into the system would be considered by SAP as indirect access. So hopefully this already paints a picture of, okay, what do they consider as indirect access? And in the end, as mentioned, while they're not pursuing every potential scenario, practically everything where you can get a link from a user to the SAP system, so whether or not there's some write, some read, anything, if there's any link independent of how many different applications are in between, it would be considered indirect access. So carrying on, obviously, yeah, we want to be able to see, okay, what is the risk? And this scenario is based on the number of projects that we have run to, okay, try and help our customers to minimize the risk and to see, okay, what exactly would you require a license for, what not, and what is in between of all of that. Because as mentioned, there's a lot of ambiguous information out there of, okay, what part of this definition should we take into account and what not. So we've got this in 4 specific steps, and the reason why we're saying a contract review is step number 1 is because you should do this independent of this, and you should not need indirect access to definitely dig into your SAP contract. Because as if you are somewhat aware of your SAP contract, you will have noticed that this is incredibly complex, can include over 100 separate agreements. We have seen contracts like this with 100 separate documents, order from exhibits, which all have custom wording where literally contract or document number 50 can say, all right, change one clause 20 agreements in the past, meaning that this is very, very complex if you're not familiar with them. So a full analysis should definitely be part of any SAP project, be it related to indirect access or anything else. Hence, again, why we say step 0, make sure you know your SAP contract. But specifically for indirect access, what will you be wanting to look out for is number 1, okay, what is your definition of named user and use? Because there's often going to be custom definitions, and that definition we shared in the previously is the most commonly used and the one that SAP publishes in their global software use rights, but it is not necessarily the one in your contract. So it is possible that some change would already be there. A second point that you will want to have to, when you look through this, specific for indirect access, is what is your definition of specific license metrics? Maybe you've got some exceptions, maybe you've got some specific wording that said, okay, these specific users fall out of this license or are included within these other licenses. So that may be interesting to see what exact exceptions have you got there. And the third part is, okay, what additional wording have you got? And it could be any little clause in all of your documents. So that's why we say definitely review everything that can relate to this specific topic and can say, okay, this specific interface is differently licensed, or here there's something else that we should take into account. So again, step 0, you should always know your contract. But then that is something you should be aware of altogether, and you should try and always look into at the start of any SAP project. But carrying on, so obviously specifically for indirect access, it's going to be important to see, okay, what's the risk in this case? So as I mentioned previously, when you're looking at indirect access, you're going to want to know, okay, where can people access data or any link to our system? Where can they actually access something in the SAP system or use the processing capabilities or anything else that might cause indirect access? So in this case, you want to get a clear picture of your SAP environment. Now, that earlier scenario where I mentioned, okay, the CFO might get a spreadsheet or anyone get an annual report, that's something we can leave aside. This goes too far. SAP will normally not pursue this, and if they pursue this, it will be very difficult for them to prove exactly what is and what is not done with your data. But what you do want to look into is any application or any link that there is between applications and your SAP systems. So first of all, for example, where I mentioned that little application that you may have built to give your employees a view of, okay, this is my current payroll system, or for example, other systems where you say for your customers or your suppliers where they can access some of your data in the SAP system or upload some data or see some outputs from these systems. So that is basically what you want to do. So this can have third-party applications involved. You could have a custom-built application, so things you made in-house. It could be SAP systems that are not even linked to the main ERP system, but have some link involved and just need similar licensing. And then it could be any affiliate systems interlinking as well. So say you have an affiliate in Germany beside your headquarters in the US. Well, say if they are accessing some of your systems, it could be that through those systems, all of your affiliates are also suddenly licensable under SAP because of their definitions. And for example, some of these scenarios are what are systems that have caused these giant claims by SAP versus Diageo and AB InBev. So now, how do you gather this? And usually when we are tackling these projects, It depends. So the first thing we always try to check is, okay, do you have diagrams already? Because a lot of organizations do have this, because the whole SAP systems are so interlinked, and then you can just pull this out and start looking at all the systems involved. But if you do not have, you might want to form a team within the organization to get this up to point. So this can involve SAP administrators, but also people who have some impact, who know how the IT systems work, or who know more about specific applications. And you want to get a nice overview that says, okay, these are all the systems that may have risks. Once you have this overview with, okay, these are all the systems that you want to look into, you should look at some variables. So see, what is the nature of the interaction? Because as mentioned, SAP is pursuing some to more of an extent than other interactions, because again, they know just as well that they cannot claim every single spreadsheet number that leaves their system as in a license. But everything in between that and the full, okay, this is a named user, could have some impact. So first of all, you might want to check, okay, is this read or write? Because that might have an impact. So, or of course, if it's read and write, and in that case, you might want to get both. The second point, okay, is this a low number of users or a high number of users? Obviously, if there's a high number of users, you're going to have more licenses that you potentially need compared to a low number of users. A third item, internal versus external, mainly because there's going to be a better grasp over what licensing is there for internal users versus external users. Is going to be very important as well. And then batch job and real-time access can have specific licensing terms involved. So now to clarify, batch job means an automated process there where you might have automatically set this up where someone or some computer process every 5 minutes, every day, every week, collect some information from SAP versus real time, where a user specifically, whenever he wants, can gather information there, can have an impact. And the last one, we noted as the 5 most important, but that said, it could be that there's more for your organization or a specific system. But what we see as the most important is whether or not it's very limited SAP interaction, meaning just one little query upload versus extensive, saying hundreds of different activities for a user every time they log on to that system. And obviously, once you defined all of these different variables, you can start identifying the risk. And as you may have already noticed as I was speaking, everything to the right here, everything in red, you will want to put this into a higher risk category. And if you say, okay, it's just only one of the high risk topics, you might say, okay, this is just a medium risk. But if all 5 are actually hit, if all 5 are part of this system, you're most definitely going to want to look into this in more detail. Now, this does not mean that the low risks that you want to just ignore them, but it does mean that practically the case from SAP will most likely be more difficult to make compared to if you have a lot of high risks involved there. So obviously, once you got your list of all the interfaces, all the systems that interact with SAP in some way, whether it be small, whether it be big, and you've defined for every one of these interfaces, okay, we believe this is our highest risk, this is the lowest risk, based on what we see, you can start tackling this. And one thing we want to clarify in this identification of risk, and something noted, there's a difference between internal versus external users, because this is something you're going to want to specifically pay attention to. And in the case from the court cases out there with Diageo and AB InBev, we want to clarify that this mainly involved external users to some extent. So these were generally suppliers and similar users that are very heavily affiliated but are not part of those companies that were most impacted. So the difference would be, and as you can see, affiliates we put in between because this will differ depending on your SAP system. So the difference we see in between is that for internal users, generally you're going to have a smaller risk because in most SAP environments, all users are going to have a license anyway. In some way, they're going to interact. So in the system, you're going to see a clear name saying, okay, this person has a professional limit professional employee license already. So then in that case, you mainly want to ask the question to yourself, is that license sufficient and not, do we have a license? But obviously, keep in mind that not every organization licenses all their users. So this is something you want to take into account. And yeah, if you want to avoid financial risk, often you can look into this through checking the access permission for each user specifically there. On the other end, we've got external users, and as you will have probably noticed already, this is where you would get the more higher risk. First of all, most organizations do not license external users. Why would you? These are suppliers that may only use a very minor system. So say you have 4,000 suppliers where the only thing they can do is access one system, as in check if there's any RFP outstanding or any other offering that you have. So this is such little interaction that you probably wouldn't be aware of, okay, all 4,000 suppliers all of a sudden might be exposed. So this is something where you want to go in a different direction here, because you do not have licenses altogether. You might want to ask the question, do they have a license? So compared to, is the license sufficient, you want to go into, do they need a license altogether? And to avoid financial risk, this should exactly be your focus there. Okay, do we have licenses for all of these users that may or may not get into different systems in SAP? So obviously, once you've determined this, once you've figured out, okay, these are the potential systems that are at risk, and these are the highest risks out there, you want to go in step 3. So once you've figured out what it is, you want to go into, okay, how can we address this? So first of all, you're going to want to, the last thing you want to do, and that's the last thing we always recommend, is to just go to SAP and say, here's a bag of money, let's buy some licenses. Because that's just obviously what SAP hopes, but not what we would recommend in any case. If you need licenses, that's the way it is. And that's something we will have to tackle then. And you should see what's the best deal with SAP at this point. But before we can go in there, before we would say, go and buy these licenses straight away, first of all, you should check, okay, because as mentioned previously, a lot of contracts have exceptions, or there might be other rules where you say this does not require a license, and SAP has been backtracked a bit because of that ambiguous first definition and has said, okay, well, maybe this has gone too far because we could claim everything and there's too much complaints and too much court rulings that could go anyway, so let's clarify this a bit. However, that clarification, we do not think it's the best, and it's mainly in SAP's benefit. They have at least done their best to push a couple of questions out of the way. But so first of all, you might want to see, do we have licenses altogether that will cover the entire system? A second thing you could review for every interface where you say, we've got a risk is, okay, maybe we can reconfigure this, maybe we can change this, and this is something we can recommend, I'd say, in at least 70 or 80% of the risks, as in, have you considered reviewing this specific scenario, as in having tried to change this in, okay, into this setup where you would not have a risk which falls within your license rules. Or a third, even if you can't identify licenses and you can't reconfigure it, you could still have a look, okay, can we clean up the system? Can we restrict some people's access? Can we remove all the counts, things like that, to just remove the total number of licenses that you need to reduce this number to a more accurate, more precise number to what your actual needs are, to what you agree you would need from SAP licensing. So that part, so what's very important there, of course, is, okay, if you address those risks, what are the exceptions? So how can you check for every single interface that you've identified in the previous step? Okay, how can you identify where exactly would we be able to get out of buying licenses? Where do we not require licenses? First of all, and we've got 5 different locations where we found specifically, this is where we see the highest chance of getting an exception. This is what we can see. So in this slide, you're going to see a wall of text. Obviously, you can review this in more detail in the SAP software use rights. But what we want to clarify in this specific overview is that within the software use rights, SAP has included, and has included for the last decades, some named user exceptions. And we want to say, first of all, be careful in using these exceptions, because SAP might counter them, might not agree with them. There is different cases where we can, and specifically, all these exceptions say suppliers, business buyers, partners, consumers, customers. This is usually for specific systems. So if you look, for example, on the first definition, suppliers do not require an end-user license if they use extended sourcing, extended procurement, and the list goes on in specific supplier systems where this is included. So if you're using those systems and you have the correct licenses that match these systems where it is agreed that you do not require a license, then you could argue, okay, we do not need the named user license, but it does not mean that you don't need another license that would cover the package, of course. And one specific item that we want to cover in this more specifically is the difference between customers and consumers / constituents. And to be honest, this is a definition that we've seen popping up in a few discussions. And while we would usually say, go for the last definition, and say consumers, constituents never require a license following this definition, we have seen that this does sometimes get up to definition on whether or not it's a consumer or a customer. So in this case, if you say, well, we've got this specific system where we're not sure, it's always good to review them more detail and to try and dig in more deeper into the licensing rules, because often it's gonna come down to very specific wording there. But otherwise, this is definitely one source that we often use to say, okay, we can build an argument against indirect access. A second one, and this is something that they published in their recent white paper, and this is something where most SAP experts actually already said, well, yeah, obviously, this is something that we thought was obvious all along, and not it's something new that SAP is now giving to their customers. However, SAP does try to present it as such. So these are order to cash and procedure to pay. And they define it as the most common access from consumers or the most common access from suppliers. So order to cash, meaning, okay, a consumer logs an order within your SAP system where they buy something from you, and in that case goes through the whole SAP process, only interacting, only providing limited data. The second is procure to pay, and again, this is the most common access for supplier, being, you know, they have an offer they can do where you would procure something from the supplier up to where you actually pay the amount due. And it's important to note, too, if you want to use this scenario, if you want to look in the scenario, you do need to have ordering per licensing per order. So this does not make sense. You cannot use this if you have a different system, a different licensing system. And to highlight this into more detail, and okay, what kind of license do you need in which case? SAP put in a little diagram there on what it used to be versus what's the new policy. And again, most experts in SAP, where I've had the conversations with, say, well, yeah, we always thought it was the second case. And this is just something now that they're claiming, oh, we're granting this, but practically, we've always understood that it was the second case. And that's what we've been building on for the last years when we've had something like this come up. So specifically, the new policy that they're saying, and this at least confirms that this is something we can follow, is that employees should still have a user license, and all external, so B2B consumer devices, would require only order licenses to cover this. From the S4, so if you have S4 HANA, they even go further and they say, oh well, even employees don't need user license anymore. You can cover this with an orders only. And from the other side, for the procure to pay, where there is no consumers involved but only B2B partners, there's a similar diagram there. So this is part of the white paper that SAP published there. Now, a third scenario, so after we've got the software use rights and the first exceptions that SAP granted in their white paper, they had a separate exception as well. Again, something that most experts always said, well, look, this is something we always assumed was true. So the good thing is that SAP at least confirmed it now, and that this is now a defendable position based on that definition they provide. So they've also defined indirect static read. Now, what is indirect static read? And they've provided a full definition in their white paper, where you do not require named user licenses. So this is a scenario where you have exported information from an SAP system to a non-SAP system. So this is where you go from a system, SAP system, clearly to one of the interfaces, one of the other databases, portals that people use, where you would have data or data flowing. So, but they do very specifically say that the data should have been created by an individual license to use that SAP system. So a named user should be the operator, and he has created this data automatically on a scheduled basis. So this should be, again, scheduled, so a batch process and not real-time access. And it should be exported by the non-SAP systems to their user, and it does not result in updates or a trigger to any processing capabilities of the SAP system. So basically, they say that the way we interpret this in layman's terms is that as long as you not access live SAP data, so the live data is created by administrators, by people with named user licenses, but rather access only through an intermediate database. So you build an extra database next to your SAP data. You copy all the data over every 5 minutes, every day, every week, every second. It doesn't matter how often, but you copy the entire data over, and you only read from this system. So you never write back into the data into the SAP main systems. Then this should be clear. And this is one scenario where we say that a majority even of the interfaces that most organizations have, you can bring back to this specific setup. But often you might need to reconfigure your system if it's not following these rules already. So besides these two that they've pushed forward, they said, okay, we do agree that this is excluded from named user licenses. There is a fourth one that we highlight, and this is something we want to be careful about, because Specifically, there is a number of SAP products as well, and SAP often sells this as such, where they say, okay, say SuccessFactors, Ariba, Hybris, where they say, okay, you do not require a license for these systems to access the main SAP system. One thing we want to highlight, though, is that while we say, okay, you can use this as a source of saying, okay, we might be safer for this interface, we generally cannot find any contractual reason why these systems would not require licenses. So there's a bit of an opposite scenario where SAP suddenly gives an overview. And if we go back a few slides, you can see, for example, for the example given Hybris in the second column there, they specifically say, okay, licenses are included. So here they say, okay, so apparently SAP systems do not require a license to access the SAP systems. We are not sure why exactly or where this is determined, but it could be in some specific contracts. We have seen clauses where it is determined, and we would say, if you have a system like this, make sure it's part of your contract, because SAP might claim this, but nothing says in the future they might not come back and say, oh, well, this was actually not correct. So we say be careful with this one. But the overall policy, and it is usually, we believe, because SAP obviously wants to sell their products over their competitors, who would require ERP named user licenses on top. So for now, is the final position where at least their own systems would usually not require a license. But even they say, if it's properly licensed, you do not require an additional ERP license, which is fairly ambiguous wording, to say the least, in this screen-capped part of their question in their white paper. And the last one we would like to highlight, and that's why, again, we say, make sure you know your contract before you check anything else for SAP, is have a good look to see, okay, are there any exceptions in my contract? Are there any scenarios that you've got highlighted where you say we do not require a license? Maybe you have to change the definition of what is used. Maybe you have got an extra license that you do, because there is, for example, also a recent customer where we encountered this, and we encounter this much more often, where they had a specific license that said, okay, in this specific scenario, if you only access this specific system, this is a very cheap license, as in pennies, compared to a full named user license, a full employee professional, limit professional licenses. In comparison, that had full indirect access license rights, as long as they followed that specific scenario. So make sure you review that contract. So overall, these are the 5 scenarios that we found as most accurate, most appropriate, to avoid indirect access exposure. And I'll keep in mind, of course, that it could be that something new comes along, because this is still a very hot topic. SAP is still making statements every month, through months, on, okay, this is different, we do not agree to this, we agree with that. So they are trying to clear this up, however slow they are working, and they remain way too ambiguous as far as most of us believe. So you may want to try and keep that in mind. Now, obviously then, if you do have tried to review this, you've come across a few licenses where you say, well, in this case, we do agree, we cannot find an exception, we cannot change this, we cannot figure out a way to reduce our exposure. Then if you do have to negotiate with SAP, you want to do this before they do it, of course, because that makes sure you're going to be able to go into this negotiation of this strength, is first of all, make sure you do check your entire estate first. Maybe you can trade in old licenses. Maybe you find out other reasons, things you can bring to the table to make this into a whole package. So which comes to the second point, is in combine it with your maintenance renewal, with your full negotiation, as there might be some way you can avoid the exposure a bit if you make it into a full package, and SAP is not going to want to risk losing that entire other deal just over indirect access. If that does come up, try and build an exception. So try and figure out a way to say, okay, so we need these licenses, but we do think it's too expensive for this scenario. Can't we change this? Or, for example, we believe indirect access, we think this specific risk is too much. We have a feeling that this can come up. But yeah, we're not going to implement this if this is the license rule. So we cannot change this to say, in this scenario, we do not require or require reduced license. And the last one, definitely, if you do bring up this term, and if you have to, then of course be careful that they're not going to suspect you have exposure. Use it to your advantage. SAP says people will be careful not to use business over this, because of course they see it's part of the news, and a lot of people, our customers, are anxious, so they're going to want to be careful on this. So this is just 4 tips that we put forward there. But of course, you're also going to want to prevent exposure in the future then. So if you've cleaned up your system, you've figured out what is your exposure, you figured out, okay, we're going to negotiate out those, we're going to clean those up, we're going to fix those systems. What do you, once you've got a nice system where you agree, well, the licensing makes sense, let's say, okay, how do you prevent this from going forward? So we've got a bit of a diagram that we followed, a fairly simple diagram. First of all, if you, every time your developer comes forward, say, okay, we want to make a connection to the SAP system. So first of all, you're going to want to see, is this exempt for indirect access licenses? So for example, if this indirect static read or some other exception, straight away, fine, go ahead. We can build a case around it. If it is not, you might want to see, okay, will all users be named users? So if all users, for example, that use this new system have a professional license, and the interface that you have to SAP, so the interface required, so the user account actually used by this new interface, is a limited professional, then every user has a higher license already, so no problem. You can go ahead because you have every user already have the licenses. A third option, okay, if the other 2 are not true, but you do have licenses or you've got an exception, then fine, okay, again, go ahead. This should be clear. We have an exception or we can set an exception, should be good. If not, try to see, go back to your drawing board, purchase license. You may have to see because your new system will or may have some exposure in the future. So this is a bit what we want to cover, and we're going to come back to some questions in a minute. But we just wanted to highlight as well that if you do have some questions there or some help that you require, we do offer some different or some SAP. So first of all, we can help you with addressing that indirect access risk. We could also review your entire SAP system to make sure that there is no exposure elsewhere. We have a lot of experience with negotiation of these contracts or just reviewing these. Again, these are very complex, so if you have questions there, don't hesitate to reach out. And if you do have an SAP audit hanging over you, this is something we can help with as well. So if you want some more information, feel free to reach out. Also on some other vendors, by the way, where we have
Sean. I was just going to jump, if I may just jump in, Hans. I mean, this has been a great presentation. More than a little scary, I won't lie, but it's been great. But I think one of the key messages that I took away from this is really about being proactive and the complexity involved with this. So, I mean, I would recommend to the folks on the line, reach out to us. We'd be happy to have a free consultation with you, see if it makes sense to help you out in terms of getting ahead of this, understanding where you stand. The matrix on the screen right now, I know most of you folks have been on with us for a variety of Microsoft related topics, but we do much more than just Microsoft. And this is what we wanted to share with you. Is the same services that you've come to know and trust from us around Microsoft. We offer these same sorts of services around a variety of vendors. So our experts really cover the gambit of major software vendors, and we offer the same sort of audit assistance in terms of self-assessments and also contract negotiation for these vendors. So I just want to put that in mind. Now, I will also mention, I know it's been a complicated topic. We've got a number of questions queued up already, but if anyone has any questions, please submit them via the chat console. We'll endeavor to get to them. I know we're running a little tight on time, but we'll try to get to as many as possible. Alternatively, if you're feeling a little shy, feel free to reach out to us. The contact information is on the screen right now. Just reach us at info@method180.com or give us a call directly, and we'll be happy to help. But Hans, well, I think we've got a few people typing questions in, and we have a couple of questions already. So the first one I'll start off with for you, Hans, is SAP has recently performed an audit through their measuring tools, but did not specifically mention indirect access. Is this still a risk if they didn't mention it?
It could definitely be. It's that's something that you should see, because one thing to note is that the SAP measuring tools do contain little indicators. For example, they can detect, how many accounts have got multiple logons at the same time or at very short notice. Things like that might show, actually there is some risk of indirect access. For example, if an account shows 100 users are accessing this, there will be some risk, but what it cannot do is get specific numbers out. So in their standard audits, SAP normally does not tackle indirect access. So this will come up only if they wanted to come up and if they actually pursue this.
Okay. Another question that's come up is, does S/4HANA eliminate the requirement for a named user, and does the revenue-based license include indirect users?
So overall, there is nothing in the licensing rules except as a specific application. So for example, at S/4HANA did have some exceptions for employees for one specific scenario there that we showed previously. But overall, there is not really that much difference between HANA versus any other older or newer technologies when it comes to licensing. So except, of course, if you do have built an exception in, or if you fall under a different, like, for example, indirect static read scenario.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. If the person asked that question, if we haven't addressed that fully, just reach out to us and we'll be happy to try to get into that a little bit further and see if there's anything specific to your situation, kind of in a more private setting. So another question we have is, one of our systems processes SAP data before sending it on to other systems. Would all these other systems be exposed to indirect licensing? I think I know the answer to this one, but go ahead, Hans.
Yes, in principle, every system can be exposed, so it doesn't matter. So basically, SAP there says everything that any links possible can be exposed there.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, we've got a few more here. Does SAP have any specific user licenses suited for third-party or external users?
Very limited. So basically, as far as we know, there is a few exceptions, and mainly older licenses that they're not selling anymore. But practically, you're always going to want to use the new licenses out there. So you're going to use full named user licenses or anything similar to that.
Okay.
So specific external users, they do not have.
Okay, I've got a question here. I think this person's referring to an audit, and they're saying, does SAP leave some areas alone only to come back in a subsequent year and raise another non-compliance issue? I think this is more around what their audit behavior is like.
So overall, and this is something that's probably with most software vendors, and SAP included, they can. So basically, when they perform an audit, most vendors will say, well, this is our best view up to the data we received, but this does not mean that they cannot come back later and say, oh, actually, we've got we never reviewed that system, or something probably changed. So practically, if they've done an audit, it does not mean you're in the clear in the future.
Okay, and there's a follow-up question that just came in from the same person, so I'm going to queue jump it because I think it tags onto this question. Is following an audit, have you ever seen SAP produce kind of an all-clear compliance letter at the conclusion of an audit?
They will probably, to some level, you can get a letter, but it will be negotiable, and it probably depends on the exact wording, but they're going to be very careful about this. And specifically, like I said, they're not really going to want to do this if they haven't checked everything. Now, again, you could pursue this, but and we always recommend that if you complete an audit, that you try to get a letter to at least get some wording to say, okay, well, what exactly is clear, what's the risk in the future, and what will we check? But in the end, if they come back the next year, they might always just say, well, it might be clear up to now, but this system was not included, it was not part of the data, or this system is probably newly installed since last year, or maybe the connection was different. So while to some degree you might get a letter that says you're clear, they will not necessarily mean that they will not come back up as later and say, well, there was some clauses included. But some confirmation you should always grab to say, if we do this, all of these systems are clear, and it's going to be part of negotiation to see what do they want to give away.
Okay, thank you. And I think we've got one more question, which is there a specific license for indirect use?
No. So again, every scenario will have different licenses, and SAP can get very, very creative for this. So as mentioned, they have, I think they've got the widest variety of metrics out there of licenses. So overall, this could be anything that they have, and they will be very happy to negotiate a specific one if you bring up a scenario. But practically saying one license for indirect access, no. So overall, it's going to be either a generic named user, or a specifically negotiated named user, or a package which got exceptions that says if you install this package, you can access this remotely through third-party systems as much as possible, as long as these terms are true.
Sorry, I've just come up with a question, kind of listening to that question, and I come from the Microsoft world, so we would often do is kind of create a profile around a community of users, kind of a user profile, and kind of get a license at a reduced price for that particular user. I'm guessing that they don't, is that something that's possible to negotiate, to say, hey, I've got the subset of users here, they only need to access this, and you can kind of profile them by role?
Definitely, and that's why we're also saying try to get exceptions in your contract, things like that. So SAP is, any scenario you bring up, the salesperson will probably try and figure out a way to sell. So they're always going to be very happy to see, well, I mean, if we do not sell this reduced, and you say, well, we're gonna be exposed otherwise, so we're not gonna set up the system, they're going to be more than happy to discuss with you a very specific license that includes reduced rights for a very specific scenario. So even more than with Microsoft, I would say, try and negotiate these exception licenses.
Okay, that's really good advice. So I think we've kind of wrapped through the questions, and we're just about out of time. So I just want to remind everyone, as I said before, this was recorded. I'm going to clean this up a little bit, and we'll be sending this out to you with the PowerPoints as well, link to the recording, as well as some links to some of the white papers that Hans has made reference to today. So you'll have all the show notes there as well. But I wanted to thank, as always, we really appreciate everyone coming out to join us today. And thank you, Hans, for a wonderful presentation. As I said earlier, it's more than a little scary, but it was really good. So thank you very much. So with that, I think we're pretty much ready to wrap up. So thank you very much. Have a great day, and thank you so much for your time, everyone.